Probably 100 times the content.
Very full.
All right, good evening. This is what happens when you, these six-party talks we hear about in Southeast Asia, this is probably what it looks like. I need an org chart to recognize Rick down at the other end, I think. Anyway, great to have everybody here tonight about obviously some very important topics that are hot on the minds of many people in town, dealing from zoning and growth to housing and just a few other things in between. What I'd like to do to get this kicked off is I think I'll turn this over to John. John Ritchie, the chair of the planning board, who will introduce the players and get us going from there. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to thank the council for having the planning board here tonight. We wanted to give you a brief overview of where we've been with the zoning ordinance rewrite. We've got Ray Will, Rick Hopley on the board. We've got George Savramis. We've got Jerry Hitmonic. And again, thank you for having us. I just outlined a couple of items that I wanted to discuss just to give you an update of where we've been. Following City Council funding of the zoning revision project, the planning board worked with city staff to develop a scope of work and RFP so that we could best look for the best professionals in this field to assist us, which led us to Rick Tainer. Critical items that we've worked on were workforce housing. Last Thursday, we voted unanimously to recommend a new residential density incentive ordinance to the council, which was developed again by Rick and his staff. Items we've also discussed pertain to sustainability, prime wetlands. We held a number of work sessions with PDA and the Conservation Commission and their consulting wetland scientists to go over the prime wetlands. We worked, one of the first steps in the zoning rewrite was to prepare an audit of the existing ordinance, and that was completed last month. I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Hayden, who will discuss some more issues, and then ultimately I think we can ask the council if they have any comments on the rework that we've done to date. So, Cindy?
Thank you, John. I think the chairman of the planning board gave a good kickoff to talking about where we've been on the zoning ordinance over the past number of months, and Rick Tainter and I just want to give a brief, little bit more in-depth discussion on that. No more than 20 minutes, probably more like 15 minutes. Just by way of review, how we got to tonight and this part of the process. As you know, the planning board recommended and the city council adopted back in March 2005 the new master plan. And as I'm sure you all know, there was lots of public participation in that, hundreds of people through Portsmouth Listens, and many, many work sessions with lots of different stakeholder groups in town. And if you turn to the front of the master plan at some point in time, not tonight, you'll see that we really tried to organize it, Tainer and Associates and staff, into four major areas of interest. First one being a vibrant downtown, and I think that kind of speaks for itself. The second is taking a look at improving the quality of our corridors in town, Lafayette Road, Islington Street, Woodbury Ave, and that, with the zoning rewrite, is looking at things like landscaping and site design and building design and signage and all those things that create quality development. The third area that the master plan focused on was preserving diversity in our community, and a lot of that is about having a broad group of people that live in our town, and that comes down to the issue of housing, which I think we're going to talk about tonight, and having housing for different economic segments and in the community and different types of housing for different people. And then last but not least, the fourth major area was protecting natural resources, wetlands, and open space. One of the things that we want to talk about tonight is some of the items that we've already started to implement in the master plan. Before the ink was even dry in the master plan, the planning board developed via Rick Tainter and staff a downtown overlay district, and that was essentially to make sure that we had retail and commercial uses on our first floor downtown and not have residential as part of keeping downtown vibrant. So that overlay district was adopted right away as an important priority. Also, as John mentioned, in terms of resource protection, we have been working with the Conservation Commission in work sessions, also including the trade port, to review the documentation that's been prepared by the city's wetland scientist, and that documentation is needed in order to designate prime wetlands under the state statute. And so probably in the not too distant future, that'll be coming out of the Conservation Commission and the Planning Board as a recommendation to designate as prime our most important wetlands in town and give them an added level of protection. Sustainability, another big topic in the master plan. I'm sure we all have heard lots about that, and all of our land use board members went through that training. And the whole reason for that is so that we can incorporate sustainable practices in our zoning and land use regulations. And planning staff and myself and Rick Tainter have met with the Mayor and City Council's Committee on Sustainable Practices, and we've talked about ways to incorporate sustainability in the zoning and land use regs. And that might be incentives for non-residential development to build green buildings. It's nuts and bolts things like having in our site review regs that dark sky friendly lights are required, or that native planting species are required that would be drought tolerant and salt tolerant and all those good things. Housing and workforce housing and affordable housing, obviously a very important topic. And I just want to spend a little bit more time on this. There are a number of areas we try and focus on in the city and at the planning board level. And I'd like to never forget the importance of retaining affordable housing. And we're very fortunate in town to get community development block grant dollars so that we can have housing rehab programs to make substantial improvements for seniors to keep them in their homes, and that's mostly directed at people making 80% or less of median area income. Same with programs for people living in handicapped accessible units out at Betty's Dream. CDBG dollars have gone in there, and into individual homes to keep them accessible. We also like to look at ways to create new affordable housing, and that's CDBG dollars and other dollars going into cottage senior housing next door, and also set aside in our Housing Challenge grant so that hopefully a group like the Housing Partnership or the Portsmouth Housing Authority will come along and take that grant money and use it to leverage other public funds to build new affordable housing. Our first-time home buyers program, which David Moore very ably runs, that's a great program, and what we need is more affordable housing stock to be able to use the substantial amount of funds that we have in the endowment fund to help people get into their first homes. The way the program works, you can get up to $50,000 per family for down payment and closing cost assistance. The challenge that we face is there's very little housing stock in the sale price range that people can get into. And these are people that are earning 120% of median area income. So that goes quite a bit further up the income scale. And in terms of regional partnerships, the first-time homebuyer program is a perfect example. We work with New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority to get reduced interest rate first mortgage money. We work with the Housing Partnership and the Workforce Housing Coalition on homebuyer education. We work with the Portsmouth Housing Authority and have helped at least one family transition from rental housing subsidized through PHA into their own home. And then something that Rick Tainter, the last item up there, innovative zoning, is a really important one that the Planning Board has been focused on for the last 4 to 6 months, and Rick's going to be talking more about that in his presentation. Just a couple slides on data. I think this is always a very useful slide to see because people forget how much rental housing we have as a percentage of housing stock in this town. Almost half of our housing is rental housing. The other half is single family. So on the red side, you've got the rental. On the blue side, you've got single family. And if you look at the little popped out piece of the pie, that 12% is 12% of all of our 10,000 housing units is subsidized in some fashion or another. Either it's owned by the Portsmouth Housing Authority, and there's senior citizens living there or family living there. It's some of the units out at Osprey Landing. It's units at Portsmouth Apartments, Betty's Dream. All of those total up to about 1,100, 1,200 units of housing that receive subsidy in some way or another. And that's about 20% of our rental stock. But we know that it's more than just an issue of subsidized housing, and this is a really good slide for seeing what the problem is. If you look right here, you can see that the cost for a 2-bedroom rental unit in this town is just under $1,100. So the question becomes, if that's not a subsidized unit, who can afford to live there? Well, right here, these guys can afford $1,150 a month. That's a family of two making $46,000. So you've got to be at least earning $46,000 as a family of two in order to afford a two-bedroom unit at $1,100 a month in Portsmouth. And then if you look at the home ownership size, the median purchase price for a house, a little over $300,000. So what do you need to be making in order to buy that house? Well, there's quite a gap, because even if you're making 120% of the median area income, or almost $70,000, you still can only afford a mortgage of $225,000. So you're well below that $300,000 median price. And this is my last slide before I turn it over to Rick, and just it means to introduce what he's going to talk more about. I'm sure you all know that after the master plan was adopted, partial funding was set aside for the zoning rewrite with the passage of the city budget July 1st, 2005. We went ahead in January of this year and issued a request for proposals seeking consultants, as John Ritchie referred to. And Tainer Associates was hired, and they began work in April of this year. And then in July of this year, we got the full funding and added on to their contract so we could complete the work. And in terms of, I've already mentioned some of these, as has John Ritchie, some of the more important issues that we wanted the consultant to focus on, because they were key in the master plan, were sustainable development, workforce housing, resource protection, signage and parking standards, design review regs, and then the overall issue of making the zoning ordinance more user-friendly so that the average citizen can walk through it a little bit more easily. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rick Tainter to enlighten us on other issues.
Thank you. Just to review what this project is about, we're calling it the Zoning Ordinance Revision Project, but it's really substantially more than that. It's really four components. And the first component is actually doing the revision of the zoning ordinance. And that is, as Cindy mentioned, we started in April, and currently it's scheduled to be completed next August. So it's about a 16 or 18-month process. And then as we're wrapping up that process, after we finished the draft ordinance and got it ready to go to public meetings and to the planning board for public hearings and to the city council for public hearings, we'll be starting up the other three components, which are to look, first of all, at the planning board's site review regulations, which are a little bit more specific. They're the ones that really look at what actually happens on the site in terms of lighting and circulation and landscaping and drainage, all of the things that might have impacts after the use is approved. So that would be one of the first things we look at. We'll also be looking at the same time at the subdivision rules and regulations, which, as the name says, deal with how you divide up land into parcels. That may not be, in a place like Portsmouth, it's not the same type of high-volume residential subdivision that you have in some less developed communities, but there's always the need to re-subdivide or to look at maybe upgrading roads or upgrading utilities and as development occurs. So that's important to look at, and it's important to look at Portsmouth's regulations, including its street standards, street design standards, to make sure that they're appropriate for a community like Portsmouth. And then the last piece, the design standards, is something that was new. The city doesn't have a separate or freestanding design standards section, and so one of the things that we'll be looking at is to what extent design standards should be created new and apart from the zoning ordinance. Design, in the discussions we've had and in the master plan, was a very important issue. We had a special meeting with the planning board last week just to look at design issues, and we understand that's a major concern. One of the themes of the master plan was making the rest of the city as special as downtown, and to a large degree we think that has something to do with the design of development. So that will be a very important thing. That's the last part of the project, and it should be finished before the end of next year. Just very briefly, I want to show you a couple of slides to show you where we are in this process. As Cindy mentioned, the master plan was adopted back in March of 2005, and the planning board, even before the master plan started, looked at the downtown overlay district as an important first step to implement some of the objectives of the master plan. There was a consultant selection process that brought us on board in April, and we've been working since April on, among other things, the zoning ordinance audit, which is our first work product that came out of this project. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to show you that while we were working on that audit, because there were a number of things going on, we also started working on actually updating the zoning ordinance. And one of the things that we're doing there as part of that is looking at the structure of the ordinance and trying to improve its usability, as Cindy said, its user friendliness, trying to resolve any internal or external contradictions or conflicts, looking at things, vague terms that aren't well defined, looking at areas that we can try to upgrade and start implementing some of those things that we already saw in the zoning ordinance audit. Then, starting in this summer, we got involved very, very heavily and spent a lot of time that was actually something we hadn't expected to do in the affordable housing issue. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that after these initial slides. But that was just something that was important to address. It will eventually be folded into the zoning ordinance revision, but it's in a way being done separately, and it's in a way partly why things have not gone as quickly in this first phase as we would have liked. So the second phase is the preparation of the first draft of the revised zoning ordinance, and we're in the middle of that right now and hope to have it done by the very beginning of 2007. Then there will be a couple of revisions, and then there will be a series of public meetings, a public review process that happens in the late spring, will result in some final revisions, and then it will go to public hearings to the City Council, for the Planning Board and City Council for the final adoption process. And then, as I mentioned, there'll be these other three components that are non-zoning: the site review, subdivision, and design standards that will start up as we've finished the draft, and it's just going to the public process. Just another timeline, a different type of timeline. This is showing you some of the key meetings that are involved in this process. We're right now here in October 23rd, and you can see we're about a third of the way through the timeline for the project. We've had a series of meetings with the Planning Board to talk about issues, initially to let the Planning Board express what they felt are the key issues in the zoning ordinance. And then we had a series of three meetings in late September to mid-October talking about looking at the zoning ordinance audit document and getting feedback on that. We'll continue to have meetings with the Planning Board into next year, and then we'll have a series of public forums, more Planning Board meetings, and then these are the public hearings with the Planning Board and City Council to actually present the ordinance for adoption. Oops, too fast. So what is the zoning ordinance audit? That's the first document that we have, and it's important not to be confused about what this is. This doesn't represent all of our recommendations, all of the recommendations that will come out of the zoning ordinance revision process. What it really is a starting point. It's a process where we, the consultants, went out and talked to all of the staff that have something to do with looking at land use issues and the land use process, identifying problems that have come up in reviewing applications and permitting projects over the years, to identify some key issues that they have. Also talking to a number of people who are involved in some way in the development process on the other side, lawyers, architects, developers, and so forth, because their perspectives are very important as well. And then obviously working with the Planning Board and talking to them about issues that they've found. But all of this comes out, the feedback we got from these various groups, plus our own detailed analysis of the text of the zoning ordinance, is basically it's a information dump into this report that is a way to just go through it and say, here are some key issues that we found. And we've been talking about these issues as I say, for 3 meetings with the Planning Board, an initial quick overview, a second meeting that looked at everything in the audit except for the design issues. And then because design was very important, the third meeting, which happened last week, was entirely on design issues and looking at some of the corridors, looking at issues like how should you review development in the northern tier, what are the design issues along Islington Street and along the Route 1 corridor and so forth. But the purpose of the zoning ordinance audit is really to look at the big issues and to look at the master plan goals, and it's balancing all of these various concerns between design issues and growth management and economic vitality and responsibility in terms of affordable housing, and looking at all those pieces and trying to figure out what the correct balance is. And as I said, it really is big picture. It's not going to cover all of the items that we'll eventually address. Then now moving into the first big piece that we've done is this residential density incentive planned unit development. And what this is, it was a response from a proposal from the Housing Partnership that went to the council, and the council referred it to the planning board. And it was a way to try to think about not just this particular project, but how could we use this process to enhance the zoning ordinance and begin the process of looking at upgrading the zoning ordinance. The master plan does have a strong goal of addressing workforce housing, which is generally a term for something that's a little bit above the lower and moderate income housing, generally in the 80% to 120% of median income range. And the initial proposal from the Housing Partnership, while it might have worked on the particular parcel, we felt it raised some issues generally if it were applied throughout the city. We wanted to make sure that we were thinking broadly and didn't have any unintended consequences. So we went back and came up with the idea of a new planned unit development style, where the existing planned unit developments, the public benefit that comes from the flexibility is preservation of large tracts of open space. And we've turned it around and said, well, the public benefit here is provision of affordable housing. And we worked on a variety of ways to try to meet the objectives of the Housing Partnership, but also broader objectives in the city. And we included in it a number of features that we felt were very important. One, to avoid environmentally sensitive areas, so we deducted those from the developable area of the site. We set density ceilings in terms of number of units per lot and number of units per structure to try to control the type of development, make sure it fit in. And we also included design review capability for the planning board as they're reviewing these conditional use permits. And the whole point of it is really to balance the goal of providing affordable housing and the goal of protecting the neighborhood. And in terms of, there are many ways to define affordable housing. Sometimes it's below 80%. For the purpose of this ordinance, we said it's affordable housing is, first of all, restricted in its sales or rental costs. And it must be restricted for, we say in the ordinance, the longest feasible term. And generally, that's something like 99 years with a 99-year renewal. But it's going to depend on the particular conditions of the covenants that are put in place. And those restrictions and covenants will be reviewed and approved by the city attorney as part of this process. And in terms of a threshold, we talked about doing a couple of different thresholds, one that would be below 80% of median income and the other below 120%. But by and large, after thinking about these and thinking about what's going on in the city, as Cindy mentioned, there are a number of subsidized units. 12% of the housing stock in the city is subsidized, and that's 20% of the rental units. So that wasn't where the real need was. The real need was really in the 80 to 120% of median income category. So we targeted that. Anything below 120% of median income, if it's affordable to that group, that would be qualify. And generally, just so you know, for a family of four, that's about $86,000 for a family of four currently. So a family of four making less than $86,000 would qualify for this type of housing. And then another choice that we made, there were some discussions about where this should be targeted, and there was some idea that maybe it should be very, very broad, and some that was very, very narrow. We opted for a balance on the conservative side, and the balance consists of two pieces. First, limiting it only to the general residence A and general residence B districts, and the general residence A is, I think that's right. This purple is the general residence A, and then this pale aqua color is the general residence B. And just for orientation, this is Atlantic Heights up here, and then I think, yes, South Mill Pond is in this area. So just to give you that sense. And then the second piece of it was to set it at a minimum of 1 acre. And why did we do that? And just so you know, the 1 acre parcels are the parcels that are kind of outlined in this palish green color, olive green maybe. And the reason we chose 1 acre is that one of the features of this is that affordable housing needs to be monitored. And it needs to be monitored by somebody. And once you get below an acre, you're dealing with less than 3 affordable units. And we thought that in terms of stressing the city's staff capacity and so forth, that would, to begin with at least, it would be perhaps an unreasonable burden to have lots of scattered individual units scattered around the city. It would be very difficult to monitor. So we thought that we want to have at least a minimum size to get at that point. And so you can see there's a limited number of parcels that are available, and actually, in fact, many of those parcels have some development on them. So there's a limited amount of development that could actually come out of this ordinance. But the reason we feel this is a good way to do it is, as we're doing this comprehensive revision of the ordinance, we can put this into place, see how it works, see what the bugs are, and then when we come with the final ordinance in the spring, we can bring an updated version of that and perhaps expand it to the extent that seems appropriate. An element of this ordinance is that it provides a density bonus as an incentive for a property owner or developer to develop affordable housing units. And that density bonus is 1.5 additional dwelling units for each affordable unit that's provided, with a maximum of 150% of the base density of the site. So there's a ceiling on what the density can be. And there is an increase in the side yards to protect neighbors from an increased density of development, particularly if these are developed on smaller parcels like the 1 acre parcels. And that's essentially the nature of where we are right now. I guess we would be open for discussion.
One thing, just at least to propose out there, as it seems, I understand there's some overlap in the two discussions, but in some ways, some uniqueness in dealing with the broader zoning provisions as compared to the affordable housing discussion. Might be some value in trying to separate the types of questions, at least until we get to that point where they truly are overlapping, in which case that's probably when we intersect it into the housing discussion. Unless there's some objection to that thought process, maybe we could steer it that way. If we start with questions dealing more with the broader zoning as compared to specific housing, we can start with any questions like that, or comments, for that matter. Tom.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very illuminating to see how far we've gotten to date. Certainly the zoning ordinance audit report is outstanding in terms of design standards and where we're trying to go to meet the criteria of the master plan. In particular, I'm just curious, and I do appreciate that I did see up there discussion of the corridors. I think that one of the things that is true, certainly for myself and many city councilors, is that well before development was discussed recently in the press with regard to the Sheraton, we, in our campaign and before, many of us received, frankly, a lot of attention in terms of having Portsmouth not be unduly congested and having growth in Portsmouth be something that is sustainable and doesn't make it an unlivable city. In particular, I'm concerned as to, as we look forward at the corridors in and out of our city. One of the major concerns that we have with these corridors, at least I think we have, is that the development too closely in many cases impacts or seeks incursion into neighborhoods. And I think that we would want to see in a rewrite perhaps something I certainly would like to see, and I invite my fellow councilors and anyone else to weigh in, things that would keep those incursions from being as difficult as they indeed are now. Again, Cindy Hayden, Assistant City Manager or Deputy City Manager, alluded to increased buffering, proper buffering, that kind of thing. I'm interested in perhaps a little bit less lot coverage or something to make sure that we don't have the kinds of incursions that we see creeping out of these corridors like Woodbury Avenue and Route 1. I would be interested in additionally looking at, for example, on Route 1, do we think it's in the best interest of the city to be zoned to allow more amusement park space? Perhaps not, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the city to do that kind of thing. I would like to consider signage and see if there's a way that the signage that we look at becomes decidedly less impactful than that which we have now. And I know others have a ton of other things I'll just also mention. I think that many of us have gone on record about talking about heights in the northern tier, and that as we approach the water, we maybe want to see more of it and have a little more space visually and from an openness perspective to get to the water. Those are some concerns that I would raise and certainly love to hear from others on, and that's just a start.
Anybody want to add to that, respond to it? Or change gears for that matter? Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just to continue along with the Assistant Mayor's comments, mine also are concerns for height, impacts on neighborhoods, really where you get into an area of commercial zones and buffer zones coming up against residential areas. I know my time on, I'm sure a lot of the planning board members will recall that I was pretty a stickler for lighting issues, and as well as motorcycle pads, but that's another subject.
Storage, dumpsters,
Yep.
dumpster screenage.
And I'm glad to see those thoughts are continuing. But my time on the planning board also, there was always a big concern between when the two zones come up against each other. Recently, I know there was a parcel down on Woodbury Avenue where it was coming up against Orient Heights. Oriental Gardens, thank you. And the issues that were resolved out of that. And so I'd like to be able to see that those type of issues are worked through and looked at, as well as height. Assistant Mayor Farini had alluded to, we've had a lot of comments, at least I have had a lot of comments back on height issues, especially into the downtown area. And I'd like to see some of the heights looked at, possibly reduced, or if not, more open space set back from the roadway. If we're going to have the maintain, for instance, in Central Business A District, it's at 50 feet. Maybe if that is to continue, then the setback from the road and side yards are brought in. Or if you're going to have the same side yards and front yards, you're going to let's lower the building heights. Those type of issues. Also concerned, and one thing that going through the master plan process that came out was an issue of not just being able to have the downtown to be a viable place that we all love to walk and shop and be part of, but also what kind of businesses that are down there. A lot of people have come to me, as well as when I was we did the master plan process, and talking about the idea of corporate franchises that have been coming into the downtown. And so it's those type of issues I would like to look into, to be able to make sure that, and not to pick on a company by any means, but we don't get the McDonald's or Burger King's, those type of places, multiple franchises into the downtown area, which right now is made up of, single owner shops, and the small businessmen that's down there. Those type of issues. When it gets into sustainability, and of course this I think would fall more on your site review regs, but to be able to actually make the mandate that dark sky friendly is not just a suggestion but part of the regulation. Also possibility of looking into, and I know we, at least my time on the planning board, we had a presentation one time about changing different roof colors to be able to keep down the actual heat that a black roof generates as opposed to a white roof. Those type of issues in sustainability. Also, and just the part of having the downtown and most of the city to also be a walkable, safe place for not only pedestrians, automobiles, but for bicycles as well, and making sure that bicycle routes are looked at as well to be able to have those allowed. And circling back on building heights again, also looking at building heights not just in the northern tier area, but also where it comes up to neighborhoods such as the upper end of Islington Street. I'm speaking of Islington section coming up to the downtown area, where right now they have, I believe, 60-foot heights, and maybe those wouldn't be appropriate to be able to try to do some control into that, that neighborhood as well. Some of the ideas I have off the top of my head. Thank you.
Okay, Councilor Whitehouse.
Thank you, Your Honor. Continuing along the same line as my fellow Councilor Smith, I'd like to have you turn to page 11 of this audit report, which talks about the northern tier and the height, and maybe taking it out of the historic district and having a mix up there. I think it's a good idea. I think there should be, in the developing of the northern tier, this is on page 11, the design review district.
Center paragraph?
Pardon?
Center paragraph.
Yes, the center paragraph, that's right. And it refers to the northern tier. And look at the timeline that Tanner and Associates have given to us. Is there a possibility that we could move the timeline up to address this issue of the northern tier? Because there are developers that are starting in the pipeline to going through the land regulatory boards already, and I'm afraid if the zoning isn't adopted in time, we could spoil the northern tier. And I don't believe that we should take the historic nature of the northern tier completely out of the picture. I think the downtown historical buildings, brick buildings, and a mix down there should continue right straight through to the northern tier. I don't believe we should make a change up there and have a different district zoned area. So that's just, I have quite a few tabs, but that's the only one I'm going to key in on. And I'm afraid that the timeline should be maybe keyed in and turned to this issue of the northern tier development.
Your Honor, if I might, I guess one of the things that tonight, not only will we talk about overall the schedule that both Cindy and Rick put up on the screen, but also I think it's important to address some of the concerns of Councilor Whitehouse and Councilor Smith and the Assistant Mayor. And we have in the past, such as was shown that early on we dealt with a couple of issues that we thought were very important, and those were put ahead of the line, so to speak. And we showed those on the introduction. So I guess that the council always has the option to bring forward an ordinance whenever it wants to do some of these changes. And I suppose you could have a parallel track. I think the overall zoning ordinance needs, land use issues have to be addressed in a comprehensive manner, but the city continues to be a viable entity, and so sometimes we have to maybe break from that and have a parallel track. So I know that the schedule calls for that whole rewrite to be done. I believe, Rick, was it August of 2007, something thereabouts?
Yes.
Clearly, there might be some priorities of the city council, which ultimately, from a policy perspective, they want to bring forward a little bit sooner. So I think tonight I'm hearing a few things like that. So I'll probably be talking with Cindy and Rick and talk about some of those things, and maybe you may see those maybe sooner than later, because sometimes when you try to bring together the entire package, these major issues can overwhelm the process. So it probably, and I'm interested in feedback from the city council, but I think it's important to take some of these major issues, kind of extract them from the overall ordinance provisions that we're going to be going through as on a macro view, and maybe get more into the specific items and bring those so that there's a lot of attention paid to those from a public perspective as well. Again, I don't know if you understand what I'm getting at, but I think you have two tracks that you're running on. One that the planning board's running on with the overall plan and how they're going to move forward to get the entire package together. And the other one where the city council picks, a few A priorities and puts those on another track and move those along as well. Your Honor?
Mr. Mayor, if I might suggest, a couple of things that we've been working on the planning board level is planned unit development, increased density, planned unit development. While we are mentioning here that it's essentially for general residence A and general residence B, we've been in some talks about perhaps this might work in, say, mixed residential office, mixed residential business. And a lot of the same concerns raised by the assistant mayor and Councilor Smith and Harold Whitehouse, it can all be summed up in a lot of what he just mentioned in that center paragraph: design review districts and the concept of form-based, I believe form-based zoning. Thank you. Dealing with a lot of how something looks, and instead of it, there are a few appendices to the back of the audit itself that introduce a lot of that, and it's an overall general concept. But I think when you attach it to things like Route 1, when you attach it to things like the Northern Tier, that one item that the board is starting to work on and educate itself about, the council could do the same and perhaps apply that to those concerns. We have concerns that it may not work throughout the entire city. We have concerns that it may, I have my own concerns. Let me not speak for the board. I can speak for myself. And I have concerns that how can we use form-based zoning in a way that affects a corridor or affects an area that's going to be redeveloped and redeveloped versus one that's just going to maybe overcomplicate something or add another layer of regulation. That's something it's sort of a work in progress, but I would encourage the council to read that specific part of the zoning ordinance audit report as a means of addressing a lot of those concerns.
Can I have one more
Yeah,
question?
sure. And then we'll go to Councilor Reynolds after. Yep.
Just one more question. Is it classed as spot zoning? Let's take the Northern Tier, for instance. Say you wanted to develop along the North Mill Pond, and you wanted to create low-level cluster housing. But yet, along Maplewood Avenue, you wanted to reduce the height of any structure along Maplewood, and then back in the Northern Tier up on the upper elevation, you wanted to create another type of zoning. Is that classed as spot zoning? When you create an area like that that's different in each section?
I'll let Rick Tanner could answer.
Yeah, actually, that would not be spot zoning. The distinction to remember about spot zoning is that it's spot zoning when it's designed to help a particular property owner or hurt a particular property owner. So it's very, very focused on the benefit to a private individual rather than a public benefit. But if you've defined something that is a public benefit, and your public benefit might be preserving views of North Mill Pond or preserving historic character of a particular corridor or something like that, then even if it's a very small area that you're zoning, it's not considered spot zoning. On the other hand, when you start zoning very small areas, it becomes very complicated and becomes a little bit more burdensome to administer and so forth. So you always have to meet that balance, but you could always do it. It wouldn't be spot zoning, but again, you have to balance the pros and the cons of it.
A lot of the things if I might, a lot of things in form-based zoning cross a lot of zoning borders, where you wouldn't just be dealing with one particular lot or one particular area. It may encompass a wide area with many different zones in it, but all having a common feature like the Northern Tier or Route 1 or Islington Street.
The Assistant Mayor, before I go to Councilor Reynolds, is it on the same
Quick
thought
follow-up
process? Yeah.
on what you're saying. One of the concerns we have as well, considered within the form-based zoning, is mass and potentially less of it.
Yeah.
Do we have enough there, in your view, to get there, or is that something we got to think about?
Don't know yet. I've got to think about it myself. Truth to tell, I've got to. We've really got to, at least in my opinion, I can only speak for myself, to figure out where form-based zoning will work. And in most places, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, as I understand it, form-based zoning tends to be the way a zoning ordinance works when it's present. We don't have form-based zoning, so it sort of do it in some places and not in others. A couple of red flags go up in the back of my mind, but I still think it's an opportunity. And I think it's something we've really got to research and think about.
I see a couple hands.
Yeah, I think if we could let Rick Tainer expand a little bit on form-based zoning, it might be helpful to the council. Planning board's had a little homework on this, but he could just
Before he
describe
does
a
that,
little
could I
bit.
just add a thought on there? I hear in, this is not what I was going to say before, but since I've been patient, I hope I can just comment on this. I hear a real tension perhaps emerging between the desire of this community to get more affordable housing, more units, through various means, one of which might be an increased density incentive, and then this desire to, there's sort of fear of what that means, and then we're going to do other things like have increased setbacks and height restrictions, and are we talking past each other with irreconcilable? I mean, it seems to me that if we're going to address the community's needs, we're going to have. I've lived in other, major urban areas, and where they've successfully increased the supply of affordable housing, there has had to be certain parts of the city where they chose, and they tended to be along transit lines and major corridors, where they decide this is where we're going to go for some serious density, and allow things to go up and allow greater density. And I'm just worried that we're going to sort of hog tie ourselves and not end up with any progress.
Rick, did you want to comment?
Mr. Freeney, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I
further?
just briefly say, Ned, I share that concern, and as we get into affordable housing, I think it will become more apparent. I don't think it hog ties us at all, because neither is draconian. And in many ways, affordable housing can become the exception that proves the rule. We need perhaps more affordable housing than we do unchecked, inappropriate commercial development. And there's a difference.
Absolutely.
And there's a difference. And so by carefully selecting the zones in which we can put affordable housing, perhaps offering more than we're talking about here, but at the same time working on those corridors from other perspectives, I think we can achieve both results without making congestion be inappropriate. That's what I'm thinking, to steer by that. I think it's hard to do, but I think we can do it. Absolutely.
Just going back to the original question about form-based zoning and kind of linking it with that question of affordable housing, the difference about a form-based zoning, which is a concept that's been kind of developed over the last 10 years or so, is that you look at zoning more on the base of the form of the structure and how it relates to the street and so forth. And use is still important, but it's not the primary determinant. So, for example, instead of writing in your zoning ordinance that this district allows, stores and offices and gas stations, and you have to have a setback of at least a certain amount and a maximum height. So it's kind of saying we allow all these uses, and now we're going to control it by making it smaller and set it further back. What form-based zoning does is it ties the dimensions to the actual use. And so you might be saying you have one lot size for an apartment building and another lot size for a convenience store and another lot size for a single-family home, all within the same district. So you have all that kind of thing, and it's all specified in the regulations. And the reason that actually can help with this affordable housing question is that you could specify a particular form which allows, for example, retail on the first floor and residential on upper floors. And there's a good way to provide affordable housing. And it kind of balances that whole build out versus trying to growth control problem. It is a new way to look at things. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is it's almost what the city manager said in terms of doing a parallel thing. We've been talking about working on a parallel proposal here that would provide some examples of some of these form-based zoning districts that you might be able to put down in particular locations. So if you had a particular intersection or a particular cluster on Route 1 that you thought might benefit from this, rather than trying to apply this form-based approach to the whole general business district, you say, okay, here's an option. We'll just put it down. Just add another tool to your zoning kit. We obviously need to do that without making it very complicated and very hard to administer the zoning ordinance. So that's the other thing that we're really working with here, is trying to limit the layers of regulations that get piled on, and trying to make it a little bit smoother and a little bit easier to understand at the same time as getting the right controls that the city needs.
One thing before I go to Councilor Smith, I saw your hand up. maybe this is at the risk of being overly simplistic, but weaving the concerns that the two of you expressed and then with what you said, it seems to me in a broad sense with development, the amount of developable area is finite. Obviously, on some level it's finite, but it's not just finite this way, horizontally, it's finite vertically, right? If you cap a certain number of feet in a lot that you can build, you are at some level capping the number of square feet that you can do something with, be it residential or commercial or something else. So what I heard your concern, Councilor Reynolds, was sort of if you were very concerned about heights, let's say, and that became the #1 priority, let's say, or things along those lines, then you could be capping the amount of available space to do things like housing or other things. And I think if I heard you, what you're saying is that's true on one level, but it means that you have to prioritize what you want to do with that square footage in a way that says maybe more using that height and that square footage, that available space, because the housing is a higher value or a higher priority, rather than just throwing some more development for commercial out there. Maybe that's the kind of decision that we're all paid to make, so to speak. But then what I'm hearing you say is, if you do it on form-based, the amount of developable area, horizontal times vertical, actually depends a little bit in theory. If you wanted to, you could say, for certain kinds of usages, you could basically be saying, we will allow you more developable area if you do it the quote-unquote right way, or if you work it in a way that we would like to see it work. I mean, again, at the risk of oversimplicity,
that's it.
That's
Yep.
pretty much what it is. And to me, that addresses your concerns pretty well, because we're basically saying there's some freedom in what you can do with the space, but the more that you're willing to play by the city's vision, the more latitude you'll have in terms of, I mean, at the end of the day, in theory, area that you'll have to develop, and that is desirable to a potential developer. So is that fair? How common is that?
That, it's becoming more common. It's not terribly common, but there's a whole history of what's called incentive zoning, where you provide incentives to get the kind of thing that you want. So, for example, if a developer provides a plaza, they get a little bit more height, or if they provide outdoor seating areas, they get a little bit more space. You have those kinds of very simple trade-offs. But I think what I'm talking about is something that might be it's a little bit more refined than that. It's a little bit more focused on getting the right kind of structures that you want without really, and I want to emphasize this, without making a substantial change in the kinds of heights and densities that are currently allowed. In other words, whatever incentives that would be provided would not be saying we're going to go from 35 feet to 60 feet along Route 1. It's really looking at playing around the edges and trying to see, in a way, how you can be more efficient about the land, that remaining vertical and horizontal space that you have and that you're not using, that somebody's only building a one-story strip mall, but maybe you can get a better product if you give them a little bit more of an incentive.
Okay. I know I saw Councilor Smith. Before that...
No, I defer to Councilor Smith. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just to kind of follow along with this form base is, and especially in a city where we have so much build out, I mean, at this point, we're pretty land poor. What happens when a project comes in and then you get change of use? From this form base, is this putting more burden on already overtaxed zoning board, board of adjustment, when somebody comes in and says, okay, I built this to be a gas station and I built it to what those standards were, didn't work, how does it then change that somebody wants to do something different later on, but geez, it's not allowed because that's not what was built, and now you have a hardship? How do those issues kind of flush out?
Well, I think first of all, I probably shouldn't have used the term gas station, because that's a pretty specific use. I think if you look at these standards and those examples in the back of the book, the back of the audit, you'll see that they've got kind of broad categories, and what it is they're not really. They don't focus so much on the details of the categories as having the use categories be broader. So the use category might say, in this particular form of building, you can have stores on the first floor and residences or offices on upper floors, or something like that. I mean, we'd have to be very careful about how you did it, but it's very it's broad enough so that when you change a use, it doesn't change a use category, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
And so I think that's the balance you have to make. And I think that, you know, if it's a significant enough change, then maybe somebody's going to redevelop the property anyway, as they do now.
Just to follow up? Sure. I think it's a good idea, and I think with that, you may start getting maybe neighborhood grocery stores coming back and so forth. But when they don't, and all of a sudden you're allowing retail on the first floor and residential above it, retail doesn't work, and now it's more residential, or residents don't come in, and it's now turning into more office space. I just have a concern as those details flush out to make sure that we're looking at those as well.
Right, okay.
Councilor Reynolds.
Yeah, kind of back to the original thing I was gonna raise. I wanted to address the issue of noted, you know, the major priorities for action in the master plan. One of which was the enhancing the quality of the major corridors. And from what I've heard and seen, it seems as though the thinking behind that, or the emphasis in that, is on kind of aesthetic, visual quality, and I certainly agree with that. That's an important part of our what we want to see in future development of our corridors. But I'd like to suggest that we think about enhancing the quality of our corridors, not only in their visual or aesthetic qualities, but also, and I think that these two things can very much work together from some of the reading I've done, that the visual and aesthetic can go with improving the quality of access for all types, the accessibility, the use of our major corridors for all types of transportation. And of course, that's another goal that we have of our master plan. And you know, I'm obviously referring to, there's a national initiative that I brought some stuff back and actually was part of that report I made from the National Bike Summit, this thing called complete streets, the notion of complete streets, that they serve all modes of transportation well. And again, I think it's not a question of that one use, you know, the traditional automobile use has to lose for the others to gain. You know, we hear a lot of concern around town about safety, and generally, mostly it has to do with speeds of traffic, of cars on our streets, and then, of course, volume and density. And I would like to see you actually used the term, Rick, street design standards. I'd like to see our street design standards go to this notion of complete streets. And if we can enhance our corridors in terms of providing, you know, bike lanes, we do a good job in the city with sidewalks, and I appreciate that very much. But bike lanes, where we can get them, you know, where we know that when the travel lane for cars is narrower visually, tends to have a slowing effect. So, and then you do other things with bump outs and things like that. But you know, it is an articulated goal of the master plan to improve all modes of transportation and the accessibility for all components of our population. Again, going to the diversity population. You know, part of housing affordability too is being able to afford to get to your job or get places once you get there. And a lot of people, you know, can't afford a car, or would like to be able to do without the expense of a car if they could. So I'd like to see us really make some effort in that direction to make our corridors serve all modes of transportation. I think that would help with the speed and also with our parking, our much maligned parking issue. If we can get 5 or 10% more people able to bike, you know, downtown, or able to bike certain places in the city to their jobs, it would take the edge off the parking problem, I think, or help anyway.
Your Honor, I think one of the things that, and I know the staff internally have talked about this, but briefly, one of the things that we might also look at with regards to encouraging people to do certain things. If for example, there's more intensity on a site, and there is a feeling that shouldn't happen, maybe there should be some kind of ability through maybe sustainable practices. I think Councilor Reynolds has mentioned those in the past, where there are bonuses given if a business follows a certain standard that the city sets up as an addendum to its ordinance. And I think that's something, I don't know if anybody's interested in something like that, but it just gives you the ability that if you're going to actually use more of the space, there is a need then for you to be more responsible in terms of sustainable practices. No matter, and I think there are ways to set up those standards. I know those standards exist in a lot of places, and I know Councilor Reynolds has talked about that. And if people agree to do certain things, then maybe there's then in our central business district, maybe there's more ability to do something with height or size of the project. So I don't know if that's something, Rick, that you've seen in other places, or is that something that's starting to become kind of a cutting edge thing where people now are saying, well, if you're going to take up this much of the space, maybe there's other things you need to do within your building for sustainable practices?
Yeah, I think you could do that. It becomes very complex. One of the things that you would need to be thinking about is your standards may be reducing the impacts of the building in certain areas, but there may be other impacts. For example, you may be designing a green building that uses energy very well and doesn't create a lot of heat demand and so forth. But if you give a bonus for that of a certain type, you may actually be increasing traffic relative to what you would have done otherwise. So you have to balance all those things. You have to decide what your priorities are and go from there.
All right. But there are places that are looking at those things.
Yes.
I know that I've read a couple communities that are doing those types of things for developments.
I think the classic one has to do with traffic, where you use traffic as the measure, traffic generation as the measure, so that if a development is doing a lot with transportation demand management and keeping down the number of people who drive cars, they get more space. But that's kind of a different type of impact that you're talking about. But it's the same idea.
Okay.
Then you get into the use changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no other thoughts in this regard, this may be a pivot point to bring up some of the housing-related topics. Let me kick that off with a quick observation, and then take it. You can completely ignore I said it. Consider it an icebreaker on this one. I think, Cindy, when you were speaking earlier, there was a chart that included at different percentages relative to median household income, what the rent would look like, and basically the mortgage payment, or the amount of house one could afford based on certain percentages relative to median income. And the first thing that struck me, and maybe it's just that the numbers computing a certain way, was that it appeared that the rental side of it, there was a rental column and there was a home ownership column. The rental, frankly, didn't look that scary. And that may or may not have something to do with the percentage of our complete stock that is housing. In other words, our supply relative to demand for rental may not be as lopsided as a supply-demand relationship on home ownership. It did go with a two-person household, I believe, using those figures as compared to somebody that has kids, which anyone who has kids will tell you that's a whole different ball of wax. But when you get to the housing side of it, the home ownership side, the numbers were far more daunting. And indeed, in my own observation and talking to people about the housing issue, really, when you boil it down, I think what a lot of folks are talking about is not the high end. If you've got money, there are plenty of housing options in Portsmouth. Or not those at the very bottom of the income scale, because as your chart showed, there actually is we do a fair amount relative to many communities in terms of the very low end of the income scale. But it's the folks in the middle that I think you were talking about that really are at a loss, by and large, in the city of Portsmouth. You have to make measurably more than the median income, which is fairly high by state and national standards to begin with, in order to be able to afford a home, particularly if you've got kids and you need a three-bedroom or larger. So it seems like, correct me, is that an accurate reflection of our housing stock pros and cons. Rental, you could always be doing better, I suppose, on one level, but that does not seem to be the primary challenge as much as homeownership does.
Yeah, rentals are toughest for families. It's hard to sort of compare the ownership and the rental, but I'm really glad I made a copy of this chart because it gets at that issue of ownership and prices. It's a little more detail on that. So let me just hand that around. This is right out of the master plan, and you can see from looking at this, it gives you the whole range of housing prices and how very little units are sold at that nice affordable level and what kind of incomes you need to get there. So if you look at the, I think that's made it to everybody now, the column on the left-hand side shows you price range for housing and then the percent of units sold. And you can see in the far right-hand column what kind of incomes you need to get to for each of those categories. So, I mean, you're right in saying, yeah, if you've got lots of money, you can, housing is not an issue, but it's in those lower housing price ranges. We just don't have that much housing, and you have to be making a lot of money to be able to afford even a fairly lower priced house in this town. But it is hard to compare renters and owners. I mean, it's young families, if you look at the data in the master plan, that are the hardest hit. Some of them are hit because they don't have that $1,100 a month. There's, one person working in the family and they're only making $32,000 and they can't come up with that $1,100 a month. Then there's other people that want to buy a house here. I think David Moore would tell you from our first-time home buyers, we've got plenty of people that want to live here, but trying to assist people to buy a home is really challenging because even with a $50,000 down payment and closing cost assistance, we just don't have enough houses at the price range to get them into there.
Councilor Penelakos.
Yeah, we always talk about workforce housing, and I would like somebody to explain to me what they class as workforce housing, because certainly service class people that are working in restaurants or lounges or hotels or anything like that can never afford to live in the city of Portsmouth by themselves. They have to have 2 or 3 roommates. Our firefighters and our teachers have a hard time, or our police officers have a hard time finding rents that they can afford unless they have 2 or 3. We're going back to communes or whatever you want to call them back in the 60s. To me, workforce housing, when we talk about workforce housing, we need to look at the situation not for middle income people, because even when you say they're on the low end, we do have low income housing, but that goes for people with families and whatnot. It doesn't go to a young teacher or a young firefighter or a service person, restaurant person. So I would like to see us kind of look around to the fact of both areas, low and middle class, instead of just talking about middle class.
Cindy.
Yeah, and if I could just weigh in on that, as far as definitions, typically when we talk about subsidized housing and affordable housing in this town, we're talking about affordable to people making 80% or less of median income. So for a family of 2, that's about $46,000 or less. And then when we talk about workforce housing, quote unquote, that's really, as Rick was mentioning when we looked at this zoning density incentive, that's the 80% to 120% category, which takes you up for a 2-person household all the way to $69,000. That's 120% of median income. So $69,000 seems like a substantial income, and yet to buy in this town, it's really not.
But even to rent in this town, it really is not. I mean, it takes a lot for 2 people working, say, as a waitress and a cook, to come up with an income that they can live with in this city, or even on the outskirts of our city now. We've gone to the realm. So, when we talk about workforce housing, I would like to see us get somewhere in the area where, they might not all be well-educated and lawyers and Indian chiefs, but they still work hard in the service industry, and they should be able to live in a city where they grow up in.
One thing I would say too, Laura, to piggyback is people, you mentioned the outskirts, not just Portsmouth itself, but one of the challenges I know that we found with our family that I think a lot of other people did is when we were going from rental to wanting to purchase a home and we were expecting our first kid, so we needed a home that could expand, and you start to say, we'll just move out a couple of towns and get more house for our money or something along those lines. And in part, and I'm not blaming towns necessarily or any one town, but for a variety of reasons, the market for that type of person does not necessarily improve a whole lot when you go 5, 10, 12, 15 miles outside, because some of the zoning changed where we were able to get maybe for the same price a lot more yard, if you know what. So, but we'd have an acre of land, but that was required. So you'd have this cow pasture to go with the house. So you were still paying the same, $350,000. Well, good news is you got an acre of land. The bad news is you didn't want to pay $350,000 in the first place. That's why you were willing to go 10 miles outside of Portsmouth. And you weren't really doing a whole lot better, except now you needed a really good lawnmower if you bought the place. So you were no better off, and I digress. And you have to get lucky like we did, and a lot of other people do. And luck is a really lousy barometer of one's ability to stay in town or not. But there's that component even as you go slightly out of town, which is very frustrating. Ray, and then I think, Jerry, I saw your hand up as well.
If I might respond to some things that Laura had said, I had concerns going into the master planning process as well. The middle rungs, especially that working class rung, is the one that seems to be the most empty. And my concern is not just with the fact that those are missing rungs, but what happens to the people who are in that 12% who get a better job? Are they forced to leave the city? Or if someone has a nice house, but they fall in hard times, are they forced to leave the city because they go from where you do have an affordable house, if you need to sell down or you're retiring into a condominium, can you afford that retirement condo where you're trying to reduce as you get older? And I think a good way to respond to this is something that Rick Tainter and the rest of the planning board has been working on. It was originally a response to a proposal by the Housing Partnership, but what it looks like, at least to me, is an opportunity to build affordable housing, not because of, as I understand it, the affordable housing through a planned unit development does not have the same restrictions on it, say, that HUD grants do, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, where a lot of what we can do is basically target some of those benefits directly to people who've lived in Portsmouth, similar to the hometown program, which targets those benefits to, I believe the hometown program is you have to live here 2 years or have lived here for 10, if I understand. Yep. And because it targets general residence A, general residence B now, and deals with just the type of houses in there, I have an image and a vision of it going after, say, mixed residential business, mixed residential office, and creating affordable housing within that zone, specific to people who've lived in Portsmouth, where it doesn't restrict based on HUD loans. And that's one of the things we were concerned about in the master planning process too, that some of these units that were built as affordable housing 20, 30 years ago, like a good example is, I believe Ledgewood just came out of that and they bought out their HUD loan. And one of the things we put into the master planning process is to look ahead to those units that have a potential to buy out their HUD loan or are coming out of their 20 or 30 or however many years of affordable housing they're required before it all becomes market units. But with the PUD ordinance, that's never a worry, as far as I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong. And being able to do it all over the city allows us to do it in many different locations, so we have that flexibility. We can do it based on the specific zone we're dealing with, whether it be general residence A, whether it be single residence A or B, mixed residential office. But the best part about any planned unit development ordinance is the phrase, nothing shall compel the planning board to approve a planned unit development. So all of those concerns that we had in the master planning process, and when I was in a lot of the subcommittee hearings, we seem to have a lot of demand for affordable housing and workforce housing that brought up 10 more challenges for every suggestion as to what we should do. But that simple phrase allows flexibility from the city, allows flexibility from the planning board to meet those challenges and not be not be shackled by our own regulations, but by the same token, allow that flexibility for affordable housing that's not itself shackled by time limits on HUD loans or other restrictions.
All right. Let's see, Jerry, I know you had your hand up a moment ago.
I was just going to comment to Laura's question about workforce housing, and I have a simple view of how that definition came up. It may not be exactly right, but I was involved with the Housing Partnership several years ago, and we ran around talking about firefighters and school teachers, and we kept calling it lower income housing, and you wound up with this tremendous NIMBY. Every time we had a project, everybody in the neighborhood would be up in arms because they didn't want those low income people in their neighborhood. So we gradually shifted and called it workforce housing to try to get rid of some of that negative bias. And I don't know if that's how it came out. It happened when I was involved in the Housing Partnership about 7 years ago. So it's the same people you're talking about. It's just a different name for them that sounds a little better.
Councilor Smith.
Thank you, Your Honor. Question for either Mr. Tainter or Deputy City Manager Hayden. When we do this, and maybe even for Mr. Moore, when you get this, if we can get this in place, how many units do you think we can create? Because of course we have to get the developer to buy into going along with this. You know, how many? I mean, I could probably say we could use 1,000 new units. You could probably, Mr. Moore could probably fill them tomorrow. I'm sure he has plenty of applications. How many units do you think that we can create out of this? I mean, if we can do this, or maybe even expand it as long with the comments of Mr. Wills, you know, if we created 2, do we pat ourselves in the back and say, good job? Personally, I think we need to do more. With trying to put this together, is there a targeted number you're trying to achieve, trying to get to?
Well, I would say that this initial phase, this initial piece that we've put together that's very limited to the GRA and GRB districts has a very limited potential. I mean, I think we're talking perhaps, you know, maybe it'll produce 30 or 40 units. Maybe it could produce more if there were redevelopment of sites, but it's not going to be a major impact immediately. And I think that that's really by design. When people were looking at it and trying to imagine what could happen, this is a new thing, and as I said earlier, the doing it now while we're doing this comprehensive revision, sort of separate from that, gives us the opportunity to really do it as a test case and see how it works. And then, as we get further into the project, we may get into the kind of thing that Ray is talking about, of expanding it to other areas. And then we can start looking at the potential. But in this case, I think that we only saw, I don't know, 46 acres or something like that total that we've got on those parcels that I showed on the map. So there's not a lot of tremendous burst of development that's going to happen, but it does give us the opportunity to look at it initially and then decide, well, how much do we want to get and what areas should we move into?
Let me go. Sure.
From those 47 acres approximately that you're possible, has there been any conversation with any of the landowners that they'll buy into this so that we can, if we pass the ordinance, we can finally get something done?
Well, we know that the Housing Partnership is interested. They're the movers and shakers. They've got the biggest parcel, so they're likely to move ahead.
Okay, but that's that one.
That's that one yes,
piece.
Right.
Have we? And I know we're moving forward on that one.
Yeah.
Have we started to talk and start looking for other areas at this stage?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I saw a bunch of hands go up. Let me go with Councilor Grosso, and then I think I saw the assistant mayor, and then let me go with Ray. Let me watch out.
Thank you. How, if we got some workforce housing up, not necessarily with the Housing Partnership, how do you propose that we keep it workforce housing? Because in 12 or 15 years from now, if things turn over, and we've seen this happen in a lot of areas where areas that have very affordable rents are now in a position where, most people can't afford them. So what would be in place to keep workforce housing?
Well, this is unlike a subsidy program. With a Ray was talking about some of these expiring use restrictions that happen with some of the federal subsidies. This doesn't have that type of subsidy attached to it. What happens is that it's the additional bonus units, the density bonus, that provides the ability to develop the affordable units. And the way it's done and the way it's set aside in the ordinance is it's actually a covenant that's put on the land, and it's for the longest, as I said earlier, it's the longest feasible time or whatever period. And typically, there have been times when when communities have done this with a 30 or 40 year time frame, but we know that's too short because that's the problem with these expiring use restrictions. So what is normally done now is, if you can get it, you go for a 99-year restriction, and then you have a 99-year renewal. And so that's what you have. It's basically, I think, the assistant mayor can probably correct me, but I think the theory is the lifetime of the youngest person living, or the longest lifetime of a person now living, or something like that, is as far as you can extend this type of private covenant. But it's a restriction that is put on the deed and on the property as a condition of the conditional use permit, and that would be reviewed and approved by the city attorney, and there are examples of this out there. So it's essentially a contract type of relationship between the city and the developer.
And these units would not be sold individually, for instance, as
They would be,
condos?
well, they could be, you can do it either by sale, and the sale process limits the annual increase of the cost of the unit. And this is a difficult, when you have a for sale unit, it can be a difficult process because inflation in housing prices, as we've seen recently, is sometimes greater than inflation in people's incomes. So what you would do is you would probably you'd want to try to tie that increase in sales price to the increase in area median incomes so that it's keeping pace. But it does raise issues of ongoing maintenance and so forth. So you have to be very careful how you do that. So you could do it either by sale or by rental.
Okay. Assistant Mayor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Picking right up on that, and I think because it really, in terms of the devil in the details and what we might pass as a city council on a dual track, what we're talking about out there is incentivized private development. We're not talking necessarily about public housing projects. So I'll say that again for our friends in the press. It's incentivized private development. And I have three particular concerns. The first being, and hearkening to my earlier comments about what do we do to reduce congestion, and then thinking of Ned's pointed up dilemma of, but how do we do affordable housing? And I think that one of the things we need to do is make sure that, I think we need perhaps more units than 30 or 40 ultimately, and I understand Mr. Tainter's offering that this is a test case and so forth. I am concerned that the amount of the parcels considered at this point in time, I'm not going to say it's fig leaf affordable housing, but it would be nice if we could identify a few more places, perhaps in certain pulsed areas near major areas of transportation. If we could identify a few more, and that might be helpful. The other thing is, I think as we go to draft the ordinance a little further, this is a great start that we've got from the city, and it's very helpful, and there are a lot of excellent points. But in terms of making it something that works for incentivized private development, we need to have the stakeholders, the developers, the bankers, the private capital people. We need bankers from a couple different banks saying, yeah, we'll do this. And we need some developers who will say, yeah, this floats for us. We can make money on this. And this brings me to my last and most specific concern, and I don't know why I'm seized on it, but I am. And that is specifically referring to the deed restrictions that Mr. Tainter's referring to. That's why God made Bob Sullivan in his department, and he can draft them. I don't know about the rule of perpetuities and what works and doesn't. But the concern is the outsale price. So think about it. You buy a house, or you buy a condo, whatever it is, and you buy it, just hear me out. The theory might be, because it isn't in our ordinance that we're drafting yet, and maybe it needs to be, is do you buy in at 80% of the appraised value of the unit, not the market value, but the appraised value, maybe that the city uses for tax assessment purposes, the assessed value. And then do you contract when you buy it to say, okay, I know that I'm going to sell this house in 7 years when I've gathered some value. But the concern is that if I sell it and it isn't still an equivalent percentage of the, let's say, tax assessed value, and I'm just pulling that one out of the air, but I think it's a good one for various reasons. Then when you sell it, you know that you're going to get a profit. You know that you can use that for a down payment for another house, one would hope. That's the theory. But then someone else can purchase it at that same price. It still works as a sale economically. And someone else gets the benefit of that housing that's affordable going on. And that's the economic theory I'm raising the question about. So in order to put that into place, if we don't have a mechanism like that, at least as an advisory portion of an ordinance, or perhaps as part of an ordinance, with stakeholder participation in terms of how it would work economically, we might end up with a white elephant. So I'm concerned that if I'm a developer and I'm reading this, you have to finish it off and say, okay, what's the deal for me? What's the deal for the person buying in? How does it stay affordable and how legal is it? Again, with the idea being that it's, incentivized private development and perhaps not some new housing project that we're trying to manage, because clearly that's not what we're trying to do. Just a thought.
I know you had a...
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, if I might follow up on the assistant mayor's thought and the idea of, and of course, Councilor Smith's, his question about the number of units and how we might move forward. As Rick Tainter said, the planning board spent countless hours on this particular issue, and I think we're ready to move this forward, and I would probably ask the chairman of the planning board, John Ritchie, that if that's correct, I think you're ready to move it to the next stage. Is that pretty much my understanding? Yes. Okay, so I understand we have to start somewhere, and I think that is probably something that, when I talked about these separate tracks, that's one of the tracks that the A priority for the city council that we need to go down. But another area that we are working with the Economic Development Commission is the whole Islington Street corridor. And what we're doing with that, with the EDC, is we're putting together a request for proposal to bring in a consultant to look at that whole corridor. As part of that, I think what we might want to do is work with the planning board and Rick Tainter and talk about, now that we're taking a new look at one corridor, maybe what the assistant mayor is saying and what Councilor Smith is saying, maybe we should take a look at how we incentivize people to take advantage of that corridor, because it is a major, we do have public transportation down that corridor. There's a number of things that are going on with that corridor. So I think we should move forward on the hard work that the planning board has done and put that in place. But I also think over the next few months, one of the components of the study that we're doing with the EDC should really concentrate on what's being discussed here tonight.
I agree with John on all of that, and in particular, the Islington Street corridor may be the exception that proves the rule to how we develop the other corridors in various terms, and I can go on more about that, but I digress. But I still am concerned that without a tied down in-sale, out-sale strategy for what we're planning here, that, first of all, I would like to know if we have, land online to do 30 or 40 units here, that's fine. If a reasonable goal for the community in 5 years is, let's say, 300 or 400 or 500 units or more, I would like to be able to identify those areas from a zoning perspective sooner rather than later, indeed, perhaps in the corridor, as the city manager mentioned. But I'm still concerned when this comes before me as a city councilor, after all the hard work the planning board has done, that when we see this ordinance and it doesn't say how do you buy in, how do you buy out, and what's it going to be, I'm concerned that a developer is going to look at that and say, well, I can't read the tea leaves, and so I think we need to have some guidelines at least.
Our thinking was exactly the opposite. The belief was that by leaving the ordinance kind of loosely structured, it would allow developers to utilize kind of all their creativity to come up with some way of showing us that this affordable housing will still be affordable often in the future. And by putting too many restrictions into the ordinance, you actually tie the hands of creative people who might otherwise be able to come up with something. They will still have to pass the test of satisfying the planning board. The planning board will rely presumably on advice from the city's legal department, and we'll look these things over and say, this is gonna guarantee that affordable housing stays affordable, we believe. The one thing everybody on the city council has made clear every time this comes up is that this is a real touchstone. The affordable housing has to stay affordable. And so, we're right on top of it, and that's the thinking.
Indeed. One thing I would say is, I know you said, Tom, a few minutes ago, that you got to have the players who are going to be doing the playing around the table as early in the process as possible, indeed as part of the formulation of whether or not this is actually going to work in practice or not. And I would love to hear, I believe that's been the case up to this point, but I think it would be important from this point forward, because it sounds like we're getting near, or we're at a point where the council is going to start, seeing how we can turn this into reality on paper here, get it into law, get it into ordinance. But certainly, I would like to know as much as we can. I believe that it will require some creativity on the part of developers to figure out how to best make this work. But to the extent that we can have some conversations with folks before we codify it and say, what are some of the ways that this could work? At least for my own intellectual curiosity, that would be helpful as 10 hands go up.
These guys have already done a lot of work along those lines, and they have brought forward some pretty concrete proposals about how it might work. And there's two parts. Number one, what's the plan going to be? What's the design? But number two, how is it going to be administered?
Yeah.
I mean, the city really can't having somebody checking the registry of deeds every day to make sure that nobody ever violated their covenants. That's not practical. So they have to come forward with an idea to see that it's checked. And some of the things the housing partnerships come forward with is having a third party. As an example, perhaps the New Hampshire Housing Finance Agency Authority to actually approve in writing any conveyance ahead of time. So, I think we can make it work.
I think with the assistant.
I agree that we can make it work. I am not, and it would be a mischaracterization to say that I suggest that we unduly restrict it. Rather, I'm concerned that the creative properties that we're seeking to get aren't being solicited, and we got to do that before we pass this. So I would rather hear two bankers, Brian, whoever else, a couple of developers saying, this is what we think we can do with these densities as they're written in this and how we're going to do it. And if we don't hear that as part of our we will vote on this discussion, I think we're putting the cart before the horse.
I would say, and I think I'm on the same lines, it's not, at least it's not a negative at all. It's really just, I'd call it due diligence that for me to feel really comfortable that we've got it as best as we can and, put our own as a council stamp of approval. Those are the kind of conversation or review of past conversations, as the case may be, just so that at least I'm really comfortable with some of the ways that it could work, because obviously it's an exciting opportunity. Lots of hands. Let me shoot down the row here. And I think, I think Ray, you had your hand up for a little while, and then let me go with Laura.
Just in response to some of the people that are talking about numbers of units and how many we can do quickly, a plan unit development ordinance is in fact a zoning ordinance change, and nothing ever happens quickly with zoning. It usually happens quickly if it's a police power, but if it's zoning, don't expect something to happen overnight. This is in response to an initial proposal, and some of those lots that you see out there, and you wonder, will these people want to use those lots? That's not really the point vis-a-vis today. What that is for is later on in the future. Maybe someone buys up a bunch of those lots, 10, 15, 20, 25 years down the road. The purpose of the ordinance is to make that easier for that person. That's the future that I'm looking at. There's also some concern that how can we do this more immediately? And I would hazard a suggestion that it would seem more likely that the most likely zone that would be redeveloped would be mixed residential office or mixed residential business. And if we wanted to have a more immediate effect on the zoning, I might suggest that. And finally, there's a lot of talk about number of units, how many number of units can we get in the city by a certain time period and so forth. And I really don't think any zoning proposal we propose as a plan unit development is a silver bullet in any way for number of units. There's no one proposal that's going to cause those number of units. And there's a lot of suggestions, mostly housekeeping, within the master plan on affordable housing, this seems to be, in my opinion, probably the most comprehensive as in the way of how it can affect affordable housing, not just for home ownership, but we can use this in apartments and mobile home districts. We can use this in a lot of different districts affecting a lot of different income levels. And I think this is where we can do a lot of work, but by any means, it's not a silver bullet. And those 1,000 number, in my opinion, I think we need 2,000 units of affordable housing within those middle rungs. But that's not going to happen in the next 5, 10, or even 15 years potentially. But it can happen if we pass a zoning ordinance that helps produce that future.
Okay, Laura.
Yeah, I've been hearing workforce housing for 10 years since I've been on this council. In 10 years, we've been going to pass an ordinance or zoning regulations, and we haven't got to it. I believe it's time that we do. I don't want to see a lot of restrictions in it, and I don't think that we should call any developers or any bankers in to sit down to the table. I think that everybody should have an equal playing field. And I think once people find out that the ordinance is in place and there is incentives to it and this goes into the newspaper and whatnot, we will get some takers. But I just think we need to get started on it. It's nice to say Portsmouth is going to have workforce housing, and maybe we'll get it in the next 30 years. But let's get it done in the next 5 years.
Well, before we go any further, one concrete, we're kind of dancing around. It sounds like it is in a form that could go to the council to begin that process. And I would propose, and without getting too specific, I think there may be some items. We have one meeting in November. And I believe there may be some items coming on that agenda which will create a robust set of discussions for that meeting as it is. So perhaps, I just want to throw it out there because you got to start somewhere to get the discussion. Perhaps we have 2 meetings in December, I believe. It may be one of those 2 meetings. That would be the appropriate point to begin that discussion, to begin that process.
First meeting of December?
First meeting of December. If that, unless anybody balks, it sounds like that's a reasonable time. And one thing I would say, regardless of the exact process, it is very important to get it going. I think nobody disagrees with you there. Get it tangible, get it moving. And the second piece is, if at no other point other than the public hearings that will come out of it, certainly that's where I think we would actively ask people to identify themselves as such as well, whether they are a banker or a developer or one of the players that helps take the dream of home ownership and turn it into reality, the folks that are part of that process, and to identify themselves as such at the public hearing and say, in my role as this, here are some of the things that you could do, or here are some limitations. We're looking for that kind of information, and if we don't get it in another place, at the very least, that would be one place that we'd want to get it. As well as it sounds like a lot of that sort of homework has been done already, so we got homework we can bring home with us to educate ourselves before we even get to this first December meeting, it sounds like. So, just a couple of thoughts, but if that's okay with everybody, and it seems reasonable, I think that might be the timeline we want to pursue. John.
Just in regards to the plan unit development, having kind of been in the business of I guess what this is talking about, to echo Attorney Sullivan, the one word you truly, I've lived in this city a long, long time, and everybody's intentions are great, and I truly believe it, and I think we'll get there. The one word I think that you really need to keep or grasp is flexibility. You got to make land's expensive in Portsmouth. And we're all trying to do the right thing, and I'm not a pessimist, but you got to give some incentives out there. If somebody's got a parcel that's worth a lot of money and they're trying to sell it for a lot less than that, what's in it for them? I would say when it comes to, keep in mind flexibility, and that is the only thing I think that'll really make this all work. So I just wanted to throw that out.
I think wise words, to be sure. Any other comments about anything that's come up tonight, or questions for that matter? Yep, Harold.
Change the subject, only a 5-minute discussion, I hope.
It's up to you.
John Dogs?
If your comment's 10 minutes, it won't be 5 minutes.
Would demolition and rebuilding come under a zoning change? And I'm referring not only to industrial and businesses and commercial, I'm referring to neighborhoods where demolition is allowed, rebuilding, expanding the footprint, and expanding the height, and changing the character of the whole neighborhood. I see this happening piecemeal throughout the city, and that kind of bothers me. I'd like an answer from the planner. Would this come under zoning?
Yeah, sure, it certainly would. One of the things that we've actually looked at is, as an issue, is the, in Portsmouth, there are so many small lots, very small lots, in tight neighborhoods with a lot of character. And so many of these lots are substandard according to the zoning, and yet people want to put on a front porch, or they want to put on a back deck, or they want to put on have a swimming pool or something like that. So there's a real balance that needs to be addressed between those types of modest changes that don't really impact the character of the neighborhood versus the tear downs and the pop tops and all that kind of stuff where you the mansionization thing, which really does change the neighborhood. We will be looking at that, definitely. One of the things that we'll be looking at is the non-conforming lot or non-conforming structure provisions of the ordinance, and seeing how we might be able to adjust those for those particular types of neighborhoods, lots that are substantially below minimum lot area. Because there's a concern, we talked a lot about this with the staff, there's a concern that if you simply adjust zoning to match what the actual development is like, you could spur some more development. We don't want to do that. So we want to make sure that we have a measure that addresses that. And we're not going to be able to catch it all. There will obviously be things, and because, as the planning board chair said, land is really valuable here, and when you're valuable land, you tend to use it very, very intensively. We can't do a lot of controls, but we will try to look at specifically some of those older, smaller neighborhoods and see how we can control that.
Very good.
Land at the top of the hills for sale.
But it bothers me to expand the footprint and raise the height, and in a neighborhood where I can see a tremendous change.
Well, certainly not the last discussion we'll have along these lines. In fact, within our council meetings, it sounds like we'll be just beginning some intensive discussions, but for the right terms. All right. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks at home for watching. And we will keep this going. I think early December, you'll see the council beginning some active work on this. Have a great night.